What if I told you there's a man living in the Arizona desert right now, surrounded by bulletproof glass and samurai statues, who once commanded the world with nothing more than a whisper and a deadly stare? A man who went from gasping for air as a sickly child to becoming one of Hollywood's most feared action heroes, only to watch his empire crumble piece by piece until all that remained were the echoes of thunderous applause and the weight of dreams that became nightmares. This is the story of Steven Seagal, but it's not the story you think you know. It's not about the ponytail or the leather jackets or the bone-crushing fight scenes that made him a legend. It's about something far more devastating and far more human. It's about a warrior who conquered everything except the one enemy that eventually defeats us all: time. Picture this: a 5-year-old boy pressed against a window in Michigan, watching other children run and play while he struggles just to breathe. Every night, his mother paces the floor, listening to his labored breathing and wondering if each wheeze might be his last. This isn't the beginning of a superhero story. This is the beginning of a tragedy disguised as triumph. Steven Seagal was born to die young. Asthma wrapped around his childhood like invisible chains, stealing away every joy that other kids took for granted. While his classmates were racing under open skies, Steven was trapped behind glass, a prisoner in his own fragile body. His parents, desperate and heartbroken, made a decision that would change everything. They abandoned their entire life in Michigan and fled west to California, carrying their dying boy toward what they hoped would be salvation. But here's what nobody tells you about that desperate journey. It wasn't just about saving Steven's lungs, it was about saving his soul. Because that frail, gasping child made a promise to himself during those suffocating Michigan nights. If he survived, if he could ever breathe freely, he would become strong enough that no one could ever make him feel weak again. California gave Steven new breath, but it also gave him something far more dangerous. It gave him hunger. The kind of hunger that devours everything in its path, including the very people you love most. At 22 years old, Steven did something that should have been impossible. He traveled to Japan, one of the few Westerners ever allowed into the sacred world of traditional Aikido dojos. This wasn't just a young man learning martial arts. This was a resurrection. The boy who once couldn't fill his lungs was now throwing grown men across tatami mats with effortless grace. But even paradise has a price. To earn respect in Japan, Steven had to endure humiliations that would have broken most men. He was slammed to the ground until his bones ached, forced to rise again while every muscle screamed in protest. Students eyed him with suspicion. Masters tested him without mercy. He carried bruises that no one saw, wounds hidden beneath his white gi. And then fate handed him something that seemed like destiny itself. Miyako Fujitani, the daughter of an esteemed Aikido master, became not just his lover, but his bridge into a tradition that few Westerners could ever access. They married, had children, built a life that should have been perfect. For a brief moment, the boy who had once struggled to breathe was finally home. But hunger is a restless companion, and Steven's hunger was growing stronger every day. The whispers from Hollywood grew louder in the early 1980s. Promises of a stage larger than any dojo, offers of immortality that no martial artist could ignore. At 31, Steven made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He left Japan, left his wife, left his young children, and returned to America carrying nothing but his art and an ambition that would eventually devour everything he held dear. For years, he scraped by teaching Aikido in a small West Hollywood dojo, sweeping floors at midnight and wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Bills piled up like tombstones, students came and went. The dream of Hollywood stardom seemed further away than ever. But Steven Seagal had been the frail child who survived when doctors said he wouldn't. He'd been the foreigner who earned respect in Japan's most guarded temples. He'd been the outsider who refused to surrender to doubt. And in 1988, at the age of 36, when most actors had already built their careers, Steven stepped into the spotlight with Above the Law and changed action cinema forever. He wasn't just another muscle-bound hero throwing punches and shouting one-liners. He was something entirely different. Silent, controlled, terrifyingly efficient. His fights weren't choreographed showcases of flash and flare. They were brutal, authentic demonstrations of mastery that left audiences stunned and critics searching for words to describe what they'd witnessed. Hard to kill, marked for death, out for justice. Each film carved deeper into his legend. By 1992, Under Siege had made him one of the biggest action stars on the planet, grossing over $150 million worldwide. The boy who once watched life through a window was now commanding the attention of millions. But success in Hollywood isn't like success anywhere else. The higher you climb, the farther you have to fall. And Steven Seagal was about to discover that the same industry that had made him a god could just as easily cast him into hell. The first crack came in 1994 with On Deadly Ground, a film Steven directed and poured his heart into. He tried to say something meaningful about protecting the Earth, weaving environmental messages between explosions and gunfire. It was meant to be his masterpiece. Instead, it became his first public humiliation. Critics tore it apart, audiences turned away, and the box office collapsed beneath him. But that was just the beginning of his nightmare. By the late 1990s, the golden age of action cinema was ending. Audiences wanted different heroes, different stories. The man who had once filled theaters worldwide suddenly found his films going straight to DVD, released quietly, without fanfare or applause. From commanding hundreds of millions at the box office to having his name stamped on plastic cases in discount bins. The humiliation was suffocating. And then came the personal devastation that would eclipse even his professional collapse. Steven's marriage to Kelly LeBrock, the luminous actress and model, had seemed like the perfect fairy tale. A warrior at the height of his power and a screen siren whose beauty had already become legend. They were Hollywood's golden couple, blessed with 3 children and what appeared to be unshakable love. But behind the cameras, whispers began. Rumors of Steven's infidelity, of distances that grew into canyons, of a marriage slowly poisoned by suspicion and neglect. Kelly found herself raising their children largely alone, while Steven drifted further into his career and perhaps into temptations that fame so easily offers. The divorce was brutal. Custody battles ended with Kelly taking full responsibility for their 3 children, while Steven watched them grow up largely from a distance. Financial disputes reduced years of shared dreams to cold negotiations. And all the while, tabloids feasted on every detail, turning private heartbreak into public entertainment. For a man who had once seemed invincible, the collapse of his family was more devastating than any professional failure. "I lost things I can never get back," he would later admit, with rare vulnerability. "Fame took me everywhere except where I truly needed to be. Home." But the cruelest irony was yet to come. As Steven's career faded and his personal life crumbled, his own body, the instrument of his legend, began to betray him. Decades of punishment on sets and in dojos had carved their inevitable toll. The lean, fluid quickness of the 1980s gave way to a heavier frame. The graceful movements that had defined him became measured, rationed like a scarce resource. Behind closed doors, the cost was even harsher. Heat pads before dawn, cautious steps down hallways, the wince he tried to hide when lowering into a chair. For a man who had once moved like lightning, even a staircase became an honest battle. And then there was the mirror, the loss of certainty, of knowing his body would answer when called. Weight became another adversary, mocked by tabloids and whispered about by strangers. But for Stephen, it wasn't about appearances. It was grief. The grief of a warrior watching the very armor that had built his legend turn against him. Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage, Stephen tried everything. Business ventures that collapsed one after another. An energy drink that vanished from shelves as quickly as it appeared. Real estate investments that became humiliating losses, including a Tennessee mansion he'd bought for nearly $4 million and sold for barely $500,000. He even tried music, releasing blues albums that were meant to show the world there was more to Steven Seagal than just action movies. But the critics were merciless, dissecting his voice and lyrics with knives sharper than any he'd wielded on screen. What was meant to be his rebirth became another public humiliation. Today, at 71, Steven Seagal lives in a fortress-like estate in the Arizona desert, surrounded by bulletproof glass and towering samurai statues. It stands as a castle to outsiders, but to those who know his story, it feels more like a refuge built after storms. A place where a man who once commanded the world's attention now seeks only peace. His garage still holds the symbols of speed and strength. A vintage 1973 Mustang, a rare Jaguar XJ 220 once among the fastest cars on Earth. But they are relics now, reminders of a man who once lived life at full throttle and now watches those engines idle in silence. What remains is family. With his wife Erdenetoya, the Mongolian dancer who became his anchor, he's raising their son, Kunzang. 7 children total across his lifetime, and now grandchildren who carry his legacy forward. But in their faces, alongside pride, there's also the reflection of years lost. Birthdays missed, laughter unheard, the spaces where ambition once stood taller than presence. The boy who struggled to breathe became the warrior who conquered Hollywood, only to discover that the fiercest battles aren't fought on screen, but within our own homes and hearts. His story isn't just about the rise and fall of an action star. It's a mirror of the human journey itself, a reminder that time humbles us all, that love sustains when glory fades, and that sometimes the purest kind of strength is simply learning to keep moving, one deliberate step at a time. Steven Seagal remains proof that even legends bleed, even warriors fall, and even the mightiest empires built with our own hands can slip away like sand. But he also proves something else. That survival isn't about staying on top. It's about enduring the fall and finding a way to stand again, scarred but unbroken, in whatever peace remains.